Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from the Neon Trees, titled Pop Psychology. Now, here's one of the funny quirks about pop music, especially about artists who don't chart that many hits. Said artists will only typically be remembered in the popular consciousness for the elements that stand out the most, which can be a radically unfair definition for a band's content. And thus, when the Neon Trees singles Animal and Everybody Talks charted very highly in 2010 and 2012 respectively, the popular consciousness is that they were an indie pop rock act who wrote plenty of songs about getting laid with almost naively teenage brand of kitsch. And speaking as a big fan of the band who really likes both Habits and Picture Show as pop albums, I can say this definitively. That's what all of their songs sound like. They might switch up their style from clattery late 70s, early 80s retro pop to Depeche Mode reminiscent icy darkwave, but let's be honest here, Neon Trees almost exclusively write songs about hooking up and having sex, or being frustrated that they aren't hooking up or having sex. It's sort of that straight-minded, narrow-minded pursuit that can straddle a line between embarrassingly cheesy and more than a little unsettling, and this has caused some critics of the band to brand them as somewhat one-dimensional. Honestly, that strikes me as a little bit unfair, because Neon Trees have tried to switch up the formula across many different genres of pop music and pop rock, both past and present, with various degrees of success. Personally, I think they scored the most points with the most committed embrace of ridiculous retro 70s cheese that worked so well for The Killers and Franz Ferdinand. But on that 2012 album, there were attempts to go in more darker, late 80s inspired synth pop and darkwave tones with somewhat mixed results. What concerned me the most, however, about Neon Trees is that the frenetic edge of their sound was somewhat falling away to more glossier, polished, tighter music. And while they did always have a grasp of solid melodies, one of their biggest strengths as a band, they might lose a little bit of some of their flavor along the way, especially considering that retro disco pop returned to the charts last year in a really big way. And considering that I wasn't exactly blown away by their lead-off single, Sleeping with a Friend, I was starting to get a little bit worried going into their newest album, Pop Psychology. Was I just worrying for nothing? Were my fears completely unfounded? Well, unfortunately, there was some ground in my concerns, because despite the fact that Pop Psychology by Neon Trees is by no means a bad album, it's definitely their weakest record. And perhaps my biggest problem with the album is that some of my concerns regarding the band seem to be coming true, which is making the band's music less interesting and less fun. As I said, this album is not bad, let me stress this, but in comparison with previous albums, the Neon Trees have been steadily going downhill, and I'm not exactly sure they can recover. Now, before everyone just jumps down my throat and crucifies me here, considering what makes their debut album, Habits, a great album, at least in my books. They had tight, well-composed pop melodies, lyrics that were shallow admittedly, but never aggressively terrible or lacking in personality or color, and a frontman in Tyler Glenn who had a ton of flashy stage presence. He worked best in the big, broad emotions you associate with pop music. And while he was capable of depth and a more complex delivery, as he showed in some of the album tracks, he was always at his strongest when he could maximize his stage presence, which paid big dividends on the better tracks of Picture Show. But on this record, Tyler Glenn opts for a more heartfelt, slightly down-tempo delivery, which I do understand from his point of view and does fit the tone of many of the songs, and yes, he is a convincing emotional presence, but it doesn't really emphasize his inherent power behind the microphone. Now, granted, the addition of more synthetic elements into his vocal production, like some of the reverb and some of the auto-tune, did not help matters, but to me, this was the first big step in the wrong direction. But okay, fine. So the vocals have been toned down a little bit for understandable reasons. Surely the instrumentation was still solid, right? Well, let's briefly talk about Picture Show, that sophomore album that didn't quite have as many of the killer melodies as Habits, but was still incredibly creative in terms of composition and production. It was flashy and garish and decidedly cheesy, in the way that sort of retro 70s pop rock had to be. But the Neon Trees, you know what? They made it work. Even on songs like the much maligned song Trust, the band were able to imitate the best elements of Depeche Mode and fuse it with their own lyrical sensibilities, and I thought they made it work. And the experimentation is definitely still here on this album, this time calling most back to the mid-80s era of synthpop, with callbacks to Genesis and especially to Duran Duran. And yet, it's a direction that feels somewhat awkward for the Neon Trees, because their loose exuberance that defined their best work has been cut back a little bit to fit with a tighter, more processed production, especially in the drums and drum machines. And what's worse is that a lot of the theatrical bombast that I loved about the Neon Trees didn't survive the transition, which made a lot more of the songs seem a lot less dramatic and a lot less colorful. But perhaps the biggest disappointment for me came in the melody lines, because not only were they more de-emphasized more than most by the production choices, especially by moving the drums and the synths ahead of the guitars and crushing the guitars towards the back of the mix, which just keeps happening in indie rock. It needs to stop. But the melodies weren't all that special or gripping. Granted, part of the problem was their presentation. The high-pitched guitar tonal choice in Text Me in the Morning grated on my nerves really quickly, but the majority of the cases, the melodies were delivered through a fuzzy electronic haze that covered most of the production on this album. And while it did fit the more depressed, melancholic tone of the record, it didn't exactly give the melodies more life or presence for me. They didn't stand out as well, and they didn't come across as memorable. And on that note, let's talk about the lyrics and themes. And here's where we hit a bit of a tricky situation, because the lyrics and the concepts of this record were inspired most by Tyler Glenn's therapy sessions. And you can tell, tonally the album is more serious, and the lyrics aren't the constant striving for sex that really did characterize the last two Neon Trees albums. And on the definite plus side, it finally seems like some element of self-awareness cropped up into the framing on this album. So look, Tyler Glenn now at least seems somewhat aware of some of the questionable things that he says. Take Teenage Love, for instance, where on previous albums, the cattiness and Tyler Glenn's trying to get over a girl he left behind and is now pining for, they would have played it straight, and they would have come across as rather questionable, but the fact they're not playing it straight is a step in the right direction. And on songs like Love in the 21st Century, Sleeping with a Friend, Unavoidable, Living in Another World, and First Things First, they do seem to capture some of that confusion that comes in young teenage life when trying to figure out who you are, especially in the lyrics, which frequently prove contradictory, but you know what? That kind of makes sense if you understand the mindset in which they were written. But here is my problem with this album and with the lyrical conceit. Tyler Glenn said this album was both intended as a fun pop record and a more serious self-examination. And even though they really do try here, the Neon Trees really can't pull this dichotomy off. Part of this is Tyler Glenn's delivery. His earnestness really doesn't have the nuance to make songs like I Love You But I Hate Your Friends or Text Me in the Morning come across as anything but absolutely bipolar, and they're the weakest songs on this album. But the bigger problem is that the Neon Trees aren't exactly subtle songwriters. And while there are moments in the lyrics that aim for more subtle material, the writing is better suited for broader songs, or at least broader concepts. It's one of the reasons that Unavoidable is probably my favorite song on this album. It's a love song that has a lot of complicated emotions, but the lyrics are simple enough to rely more on the vocal presentation to carry that nuance, which probably was the best way they could have done that. On top of that point, for as much as this record claims to have an actual message, mostly about how it's important to find out who you are, but sometimes you might need to grow up first to really figure out and really accept it, it's still a thin concept at best. And sure, I can respect the growing maturity of the performance here, but when the songwriting doesn't quite match it and the presentation loses some of the color and personality along the way, I can't help but feel that youthful immaturity might have been the Neon Trees' biggest hidden strength, for as crazy as that sounds. So look, I don't dislike this album, and I do respect that it was written during a very complicated time in Tyler Glenn's life, but I don't enjoy it as much as I do previous Neon Trees albums, and it definitely feels like the band weren't playing to their strengths, especially in instrumentation and in production. Now, I'll admit some of this is me and my personal preferences. I prefer some degree of bombast in my pop rock, and that's one of the reasons Fall Out Boy, Panic at the Disco, and other such bands have gotten passes from me in the past. But even acknowledging the improvements in the songwriting, and there were some measurable improvements, it's not enough to save this album just being kind of decent for me in my books and not much better. I'm sorry, but it's a 6 out of 10 for me, and only a recommendation if you're a hardcore fan of the band. The fact is, I've heard better pop rock released this year. And even though the Neon Trees have grown up, in the young man's game of pop music, that's not always the way to go. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know some of you might be a little bit angry, but hey, I really wanted to like this album. I listened to it 10 times before writing this review, and yeah, it just was not clicking with me. I respect how heartfelt it was, just didn't work for me. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other elements, any other albums coming out this year that you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark. I'll see you next time.